Now that we've got, in theory, a better sense of how the bounds system works, let's apply that knowledge to positioning our main window when we show it on the screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a little bit of code to figure out the X direction, or excuse me, both the X and Y direction bounds of the click event and the bounds of the window itself. Then, right before we show the window, we will position it correctly on the screen. And so we still have to talk about exactly how we position the window on the screen, but again, that's something that's fairly straightforward and we can definitely figure out on the fly. So first, we're going to get the click event bounds. So that's pretty much the code that we just had on the screen with the console log. We'll look at this bounds object and we'll destructure off the X and Y value from it. So again, X and Y from the bounds object, that communicates how far over to the left and how far down the screen the icon is. Next, we're going to get the overall dimensions of the window itself. Now you might be thinking, well, Stephen, can't we just say that the overall dimensions are like 500 and 300? And the answer is that that is just really poor practice. And the reason for that is that later on, at some point in the future, we might decide that this window needs to be slightly larger or slightly smaller. And so we might come back here and say that, okay, well, the height is now 600. But we might not remember to change the positioning of the window as well. So really, we want to dynamically figure out these bounds on the fly, rather than trying to hard code the position on the screen. One other thing that I want to mention about the positioning of these elements is that we always have to be aware of the case on Windows specifically, where a user moves the taskbar on their screen. So if you're on Windows, you may know that the taskbar down here, it's not fixed to the bottom of the screen per se. Our users can choose to position the window up at the top like this as well. Or if they wanted to, they can put it to the right-hand side over here. I personally, for years when I used PCs, I used to use the taskbar on the left-hand side like this. And so if we start to hard code the position of the window, it's going to undoubtedly break on some users' machines. So instead, we really want to make sure that we dynamically figure out this positioning. Okay, so back over here. So we've got the click event bounds. Now we want to figure out the bounds of the window itself. To do so, we can call mainWindow.getBounds. Now the benefit of calling getBounds right here is that it's also going to work correctly in the case that a user resizes the window. So for our application, we said that a user cannot resize it, but maybe you on your own personal application want to allow resizing. If the user resizes the window, when you call getBounds, it'll give you the updated bounds of the window or the updated height and width. So we're going to say window height and width is coming from this call right here. And we're going to destructure off two properties from an object that gets returned from this function, which are the height and the width of the window. Okay, so again, height and width of the window, that's telling us the X direction bounds of the window itself and the Y direction bounds of the window itself. So now it's time to take these two sets of dimensions and set the size of the window right before we show it to the user on the screen. So to dynamically set the positioning of the window, we're going to call a function called mainWindow.setBounds. So setBounds right here can be used to change not only the height and width of the window, but also its positioning on the screen as well. In total, we're going to give this setBounds function 4 separate arguments. We're going to tell it its X direction, or its X position, its Y position, its height, and its width. So as you might imagine, the X and the Y options right here specify how far over to the left-hand top corner of the window we want to position this thing. And the height and the width specify exactly how tall and how wide we want the window to be. Now in the case of the height and width, we don't really want to change these values at all. Like we're totally fine leaving the height and the width as they are. We don't really want to modify those. So we're just going to say, hey, that's totally fine. We're going to keep the height as the height and the width as the width, exactly what it is currently. No change there. However, we do want to update the X and the Y positioning of the window a little bit. So to calculate the X and the Y position, this is where we're going to have to do a little bit of cross-platform compatibility. I'm going to say that first, we're going to take care of OS X. So we're going to address OS X first. We're going to get it working on there. And then we'll come back and do a little bit of cross-platform checking to make sure that it works correctly on Windows as well. So to figure out the exact X direction or X positioning of this window, remember, it's going to be the click event X direction bounds minus half of the window bounds. So in practice, give me the full X direction. That is the how far over to the left or to the right, I should say, the click event was, minus half of the width of the window. Then for the Y positioning, it's going to be exactly equal to the click event Y direction bounds, which on OS X really is going to end up being 0 most of the time. But for us, we'll just future-proof just in case we ever change anything and say, yeah, we can just make sure it's Y. Okay, now a little bit of ES6 cleanup that we're going to do here. Notice how the key and the value for Y, height, and width are all identical. Rather than providing both the key and the value for each of these, I'm going to condense it down to just be Y, height, and width. Again, this is a little bit of ES6 code right here. If the key and the value are identical, we can condense it down to just the single word. Okay, I think we're ready for a little bit of a test. Now I want to remind you right now that I really only expect this to work correctly on OS X right now. We'll come back in just a second and make sure that it works correctly on Windows as well. So back at the console, or the terminal, I'll restart my application. Now when I click on the icon, the window that appears is positioned directly centered right underneath the icon, which is exactly what we want to see. So this is looking pretty darn good. When a user opens it up, it appears right here. So it's obviously very closely associated with the icon. So this is working pretty darn well. Let's continue in the next section, and we're going to make sure that we fix this thing so that it works correctly on Windows as well. So I'll see you in just a second.